Excellent. I'll take the speaker for a speech and invite Tom.
In this debate, Sydney was keen to examine the situation where we had cities who were large, that developed parts on their urban fringe and allowed people to live there. Even if their criticisms of that situation were correct, there were a number of things about that situation that they never acknowledged. One, that the people who chose to move into those areas had consented to that, and that our model allowed them to consent to happen more because we were willing to increase people's economic freedom and allow the market to respond to people's desire to make those choices. And two, that their alternative was based on the quixotic idea that they could just magically make cities denser or magically create smaller cities without telling us how they could get the political will or build the infrastructure that was necessary to make that work. I'm going to ask three questions in this today. Firstly, what do cities actually look like under the two models? Secondly, what are the environmental consequences of our model? Thirdly, who gets the best development? First question, what do cities look like in this debate? Both sides acknowledge that what was happening in practice in the real world was that populations were increasing and the populations were urbanizing. People had to go somewhere. Sydney wanted to build up to accommodate for that. We told you why that wasn't possible. We gave you two reasons. Firstly, we told you politically that there was a group of elites who were rich and wealthy in cities who wanted to price poor people out of the market to protect their own housing prices, their own views, and their own neighbourhoods, to protect them from other ethnic groups or people who they thought were worse than that. The only response we ever got from that from Sydney was that the better way to do that is to force all of these people to live in one area, so people have to respond to that imperative. Here's the problem, guys. The actual counterfactual you were dealing with in this debate was people just not living in that city. People weren't forced to build up, right? Because all the rich people had to do was exclude people from living in that city at all, and just force the poor people to live in rural areas instead. Areas where they didn't have access to the economic opportunities where it was necessary which was necessary for them to be able to have the liberty that you guys wanted to give them. That meant that all of your material about how it's good if people use land efficiently, about how we force these people to live in small areas, never stood up because you guys never acknowledged the actual alternative in this debate, which is simply that people didn't have access to living in those cities at all. The second thing that we told you about why dense cities weren't actually practical was that there were problems with infrastructure costs, something to which we've had no response from Sydney. We told you, if you've got an area that has already been built up, it makes it much harder to build things like public transport corridors, to increase the amount of electricity use that you have there. We thought that that made density harder to do. We also thought that it meant that when you made cities denser, you made them worse, because it meant less people were serviced by that infrastructure. The kinds of situations where building upwards is either not politically feasible or not economically feasible were the reasons why countries like China and South Africa massively restrict urbanization in a way that creates a massive group of rural poor people who have no ability to access those high-tech, high-paying manufacturing jobs. Our model was the only one in this debate that actually allowed the market to become more responsive. Because if it was true that there was a situation where there weren't those economic and political barriers to high-rise development, and if it was also true that people wanted to live in those high-rise development areas, then our model allowed the market to respond to that incentive as well, and to build up in that context as well. You guys didn't need to just prove that denser cities were better, but it was also legitimate to restrict the ability of the market to choose whether density or sprawl was better off. But there was also reasons to believe that denser cities were worse. Because infrastructure was likely to be worse, that meant that you got ethnic ghettos in those cities. That was really problematic because it encouraged other parts of those cities to deliberately try and restrict the ability of poor people to go into other neighbourhoods. So you see things like in Sydney's North Shore, where wealthy people use zoning laws and they use their political power to ensure that no development can ever happen on the North Shore, which forces poor people to ghettoise and live in other areas. That's what happens when you get those dense areas that aren't serviced properly with infrastructure. But also, we told you that ghettos were likely to occur outside those cities. The only other alternative Sydney ever gave you was that we can just build smaller cities. They never told us why that would be better land use, even though those cities would require all kinds of infrastructure that would cause all kinds of economic damage. They also never told us how it was ever going to be economically viable, just to pick a piece of land and decide to dump a whole lot of people there. We never thought that was actually practical. Second question, who are the best environmental consequences in this debate? Sydney talked to you a lot about the perils of using land for things other than natural ecosystems. cities. The problem was that almost all of their harms related almost exclusively to resource extraction and almost not at all to urban sprawl. People don't log the Amazon because the urban fringe are Brazilian cities. Brazilian cities are all along the coast. People log the Amazon because they want to sell rubber and timber. The same thing is true of a clearing of land that kills orangutans and tigers in Borneo. That's to create palm oil plantations. That has nothing to do with urban sprawl. No one fucking lives in Borneo. People want to cut down trees to get that palm oil from there. We thought that land had to be used somewhere. You guys didn't give us a proper alternative to on the fringes of those cities. We also told you that we were willing to protect land that was ecologically important because national parks were different to green belts. We just thought that assessment should be based on environmental value rather than just an arbitrary restriction of the city limits. Finally, we told you that development was more important, that the amount of land that we were taking up wasn't that much in the scheme of things, and that what really mattered in this debate was making sure that people were economically empowered. There were also reasons why denser cities were worse for the environment. If you couldn't service infrastructure properly, that means you couldn't get things like public transport, which means people had to use cars, which was worse. You also had problems like you couldn't have green spaces as easily, which made problems like smog worse. Then Sydney told us that these cities use less resources. That's only true if you have the ability to create the efficiencies. You can't, because you don't have room to create that infrastructure. Final question in this debate. Who created development better? Richard told you right at the start of our case that we make the market more responsive to the desires of people to live in cities where there are better paying jobs and more productive enterprises. What we heard from Beck was that developers can still price gouge and continue to price these people out of their cities. Except that wasn't true because the market was more competitive. But it also wasn't true because there's an obvious incentive to provide low-cost housing. If people want to move into the city, you can make a profit of providing that low-cost housing if people want to move from rural areas to the city. Then Beck told you they were competing in different housing markets. We told you why there was fallacious, because what mattered in this debate was how the land was being used. And obviously you could either have rich people using that land, or you could have poor people using that land. Then Sydney told us that their model was better because it allowed more people to live in the inner city rather than the outer suburbs. We told you that wasn't the actual counterfactual. The actual counterfactual was just people living in rural ghettos. We also told you why denser cities were worse for a number of reasons. Finally, we told you that development upwards was economically and politically viable for a number of reasons. We gave you a whole lot of reasons why the urbanisation that we created gave massive benefits to real people. We told you it gave them more choices about where they could live. We told you it allowed the development mechanism of people moving from subsistence agriculture to high-tech manufacturing to work more effectively. We told you that it meant that poor people were able to live in those cities, we gave it more political power. We told you that it gave more options to labour. It forced employers to compete, to offer the best conditions and the best wages when labour had more ability to move from the country to the city and from one city to the next city. Our model was the only model that was ever going to provide those benefits because we were the only model that allowed the market to respond to the incentives that people had to create that change. We were the only model that expanded the ability of developers to actually create more houses, that facilitated people moving into that city where they could get better opportunities for themselves and their family. We thought that Sydney's environmental rhetoric in this debate was a red herring because it didn't deal with the fact that there was no special reason why the land on the edges of the cities happened to be the land that was most important to protect. We thought that the most important stakeholder in this debate were people in the poorest countries who were economically disempowered the most. That was the group that we held on our side of the case. We were very proud to propose.